All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro Podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. On the show with me today, we have a very special guest, Dave Siever. Dave graduated from the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology in 1978 in telecommunications. In 1980, he accepted a position at the University of Alberta, Faculty of Dentistry, as a design technologist. He conducted research with Dr. Norman Thomas, an internationally recognized specialist in the area of temporomandibular dysfunction and myofascial pain. During his employment there, Dave developed equipment for the TMJ Research Lab and the Educational Psychology Department, including TENS stimulators, biofeedback devices, signal processing equipment, and EMG spectral analysis equipment. In 1983, Dave began assisting teaching a dental physiology course at the University of Alberta, and in 1987 and 1988, he taught graduate year courses, Advanced Myofascial Pain and TMJ Diagnostic and Treatment Techniques. Dave published a paper with Dr. Norman Thomas on the effects of audiovisual stimulation at the 4th European Congress of Hypnosis in 1987. Dave, I could keep going, but welcome to the show.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Toby. I'm glad to be here.
So tell me with dentistry, how did you originally find yourself in that field kind of before making the transition to more of this audiovisual entrainment that you do now with Mind Alive?
Well, yeah, that was interesting. You know, I've always been interested in psychology and I've always loved electronics. So lucky for me, I'm doing the exact things I love to do. And I'm very impassioned about it. And that certainly makes a difference in terms of a person's drive and the things they may accomplish in their lifetime. But yeah, I was working for the phone company at the time. I had a friend who landed this job in oral physiology at the U of A doing TMJ research, and they were trying to design some special equipment that measured nerve impulses to the jaw and things like this to try to determine the severity of a TMJ problem. And inadvertently, we discovered that we could easily diagnose whether or not a TMJ problem was dental or whether or not it was psychological, which we discovered a few years into it after we did a lot of research. But meanwhile, he couldn't design what they needed designed. He wasn't able to do it. Meanwhile, I was working in my basement designing it for him because I was just having so much fun. And I had about half done. And so when he left the U of A and dentistry there, I just went in with the schematic drawings. I showed it to the professor and they hired me on the spot. And that's how it came to be from there. But in the process of doing research, I discovered that so many of our patients had psychological inputs to their TMJ. So much so actually that we could tell who was going to fail and who was going to succeed when we were doing splint therapy, just by how they were responding and things like this. So I got involved in the EdPsych department. They had some biofeedback equipment there under George Fitzsimmons, and started realizing the whole psychological side to it, and started taking our patients across and teaching them biofeedback and how to relax their jaws. I also found that like 90% of all of our patients were housewives, usually a couple toddlers, a big mortgage. The interest rates were very high in Canada in those days. They were like 18% interest rates. They were brutal. And there's a lot of stress. Plus, Alberta's an oil-producing province, much like Texas, and oil prices had crashed to like $15 a barrel. So all their husbands with big mortgages were losing their jobs or risk of losing their jobs and wage rollbacks and things like this. So I discovered, I was administering the Holmes-Ray psych inventory, and discovered that almost all of these women had a increase in arguments with spouse and financial worries 3 to 6 months prior to TMJ pain. And so that was really the clincher, and that's what really got me on the psychology side. Meanwhile, I was designing equipment. I had built a pretty fancy research lab, and we would put electrodes all over our face on all the different muscles. And sometimes these old electrodes in the old days, you had to stick on a little thing and peel it off, put gel in it. It was a big job. And every electrode probably took 10 minutes, And so by the time we got 15 or 20 electrodes on our face and then got hooked up into the gear, often it was lunch. So we would just tie me up, put a pigtail on my, tie all these wires into a ponytail, go down for lunch. And everybody would notice I had this ponytail and all these electrodes all over my face. And sometimes Dr. Thomas did. But anyway, sort of this reputation of us being mad scientists started kind of spreading around. Excuse me. Then in 1984, an instructor in performing arts gave me a call and asked me to build this new age, what I thought was a new age nonsense, this flashing light machine with pulsing sounds so he could help his students overcome stage fright. And I said, I really thought this was like new age hocus pocus as you could get. But anyway, I decided to build him one, which took a long, long time. It took me 9 months or so to build him one. Unfortunately, I made a copy for myself. And in the process of building this entrainment device, man, was I intrigued by what flashing lights, the effects of flashing lights were on my psyche. It was wild, the stuff that lights were doing. And I was very excited about it. Meanwhile, though, I built his machine, got it to him. He was using it on students with stage fright. I had severe anxiety too, having a new mortgage and one or two children at that point. And a lot of stress, high mortgage rates. The university didn't pay so well. So we were struggling financially. Everything was tight, living month to month. And there was a lot of stress. And I was struggling with anxiety myself. So I started putting on the unit, and it would just melt that anxiety like butter and just be gone in 20 minutes. So then I thought, yeah, in 1988, I thought, well, maybe it was in 89, I thought we should really do a study on our worst TMJ patients that we've got, everybody with 10 years of chronic pain, and see if we can really help them. These are people where splint therapy isn't working really because it's not of dental origins, it's of psychological origins. So that's when we ran the study, and all 10 of 10 were pain-free in 15 minutes. So it was, and many of them had no pain at all for several days following this entrainment session. So then I started thinking, wow, this is real science. There's something to this. And then I spent hundreds of hours in the health sciences library digging through research of all kinds, and found that there's hundreds and hundreds of, if not thousands of studies nowadays on flashing lights in or pulsing tones into the brain and brain waves out. But I also found that a handful, maybe 10, 15, 20 studies on psychological aspects of entrainment. Enough for me to really start feeling that I had something here. It was a real thing. It was an actual science, and discovered that entrainment got popularized in the United States primarily through William Kroger, who was a physician in the US military. And it was his job during the Second World War to find out how come Americans were driving their battleships into enemy territory and their bomber planes into enemy territory, and suddenly they're getting shot at. And they should have seen this on their radar long before. And they discovered the radar guys were all in trance. And it had a lot to do with these old-fashioned radars didn't hold an image on the screen like modern screens do nowadays. And this little line would go around in a little circle, and there'd be a little blip, blip, blip. And the hypnotic aspects of this little blip would put them into a trance, and they just watched the enemy come right on screen and tranced out. So that prompted William Kroger to team up with another fellow, Sidney Schneider, and in 1957, they built the first commercial brainwave stimulation device called the brainwave synchronizer. And that's really what started sort of the psychological side of entrainment. And then since then, of course, audio has been added to it, and we've done a whole host of modifications and augmented the technology in huge ways. My most recent development with entrainment has been randomizing of stimulation, which is working incredibly well for brain injuries and concussions, just remarkably well. But you can't randomize it too much. If you randomize it too much, it doesn't work at all. You just randomize it mildly just by up to no more than plus minus 1 hertz. And it is dramatically more effective than any fixed frequency. And that's because entrainment plays on glia. And a lot of people with concussions and brain injuries, even if it's viral, and we'll see what COVID does here, but I'm sure we're going to see similarities there. And it shuts down glia through a process called reactive gliosis. And in the process, lactate and ATP get shut down. And in the process, the glia or astrocytes are shutting down. That in turn shuts down norepinephrine in the brain, shuts down the calcium gradient, which all neuronal synapses must have calcium gradient to fire. And this whole process eventually crashes the brain, and you lose your thalamocortical loop. You can't make alpha waves anymore, so they all have pretty severe anxiety, and they can't make delta waves either, so they all have insomnia. And we also see every single one of them has the peak of their or the locus of their activity is right down the cingulate, and every single one of them has OCD. So they're upset, they're hoarders, counters, cutters, ritualists, anorexics, committed substance abusers, and things like this. So entrainment, turns out it drives up lactate and ATP 260% in 5 minutes. And I can take people who've been shut down, and so far my longest case has been 25 years, a guy who's completely shut down for 25 years after he had sustained a brain injury from falling off a slide when he was 6. And now he's 31 and he's completely dysfunctional. We had him completely functioning in 15, 20 minutes. And it's just remarkable what's going on with some of the aspects of entrainment that we never would have dreamed of, 30 years ago, just never would have dreamed of. But cerebral blood flow studies, lactate ATP, heat shock protein, cytokines, non-inflammatory cytokine study just got published a few years ago, show that flashing lights have powerful implications on brain physiology and also improved functioning. There you go. How's that for a start?
There are so many different directions I could go off of that, but to I guess back up in terms of, tell me kind of about what is actually happening to the brain when you either pulse lights or tones into the ears. What is actually taking place there in the brain?
Yeah, I'll start with the lights. Well, the whole concept of entrainment means you've got a frequency of some kind of stimulation into an organism, and the organism will respond with the same frequency somehow. In the case of us, we're putting lights and tones into the eyes and ears, and we're seeing the brain waves respond with a matching frequency. And that's the whole concept of entrainment, which was discovered in 1934. However, that's all they looked at. And it was a long, long time, like 60 years or so, before they had sophisticated enough equipment with PET scans and MRIs and things like this before they could look at deeper aspects of entrainment. So everybody thought it was a frequency thing. It turns out frequency is the least of what entrainment does. It drives up cerebral blood flow. It dissociates people in a meditative way that is very powerful. Almost everyone with a psychological issue has anxiety as a side effect of being in dysfunction. And it just melts that tension. Of course, when you have anxiety, it not only does it really stress your adrenals, but it really cranks up norepinephrine in the brain, shuts down serotonin, and shuts down frontal cerebral blood flow. So you become ADHD-ish, you become impulsive, you can become aggressive, and you're tired. And almost everybody with any psychological issue has those as comorbid conditions or symptoms. And so entrainment shuts that process down extremely effectively. And we use it for trauma, PTSD. War vets are using it a lot. First responders use it. Stressed out medical workers right now dealing with COVID are using it. So that's a powerful aspect of entrainment, is this dissociative and we call it dissociation and restabilization is what we call it. It breaks the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, basically. But it does other things. It drives up cerebral blood flow very significantly. It increases heat shock protein quite dramatically. And heat shock protein is a protein that the brain or the body generates heat shock protein when it's under stress. And they called it heat shock protein because originally they found that if they took an organism and they put it into hot water and kept making the water hotter and hotter and hotter to the point where it started to kill cells in the animal's body, they found that the animal would get flooded with these heat shock proteins as the body was trying to protect the cells. And heat shock protein is very protective of cells, trying to keep them alive as long as possible. But also salivary heat shock protein has quite an impact on killing pathogens like viruses and bacteria. So if you're high in heat shock protein, you have natural immunity to things that you would inhale or put into your mouth. In the brain, however, it's also very effective as an anti-inflammatory chemical, and it's always present trying to combat inflammation of the brain, like post-concussion or cancers, things like this, as the brain is trying to protect itself. And a study showed that that flashing lights at 10 hertz, so alpha band, that's they only looked at alpha, but it drove up heat shock protein 160%, which is 180%, which is pretty impressive. It also drives up serotonin. And again, people with issues are low in serotonin. Typically, they're high in norepinephrine in the acute stages, but as they exhaust themselves, the norepinephrine in the brain also crashes and serotonin crashes with it. And often also endorphins crash. So entrainment has been shown over 30 minutes to drive up serotonin 23%, norepinephrine 18%, and endorphins, I think 13%. So there's a whole neurotransmitter side to it. And then a study done by Singer and her group found that entrainment was very effective at driving up non-inflammatory cytokines, which again are very important for brain function. So there's a lot of things that entrainment does that have nothing to do with actual frequency. And in fact, with our brain injury, our TBI group, traumatic brain injury group, these people can't make alpha because that's this whole thalamocortical loop where alpha is generated from gets shut down as a part of the whole reactive gliosis process and all of that. And they're basically low voltage and they're pretty much flatlined on an EEG, very, very flat. And they show a locus of slow theta right down the cingulate, so they're always obsessive compulsive as well. And we put them on entrainment, but not alpha. So, and this shows where the frequency model of entrainment doesn't work so well, because in the past, Chris, these guys are alpha deficient, so I'm giving them alpha, but it's not working very well. Occasionally it worked, and some, but nothing remarkable. And then I read some studies about brain stimulation, and these people who have the shutdown, they were hitting them with beta and other frequencies and just really sort of like hammering the daylights out of the brain. And for whatever reason, they're forcing it to jumpstart itself and fire itself back up. So I started experimenting with randomized SMR beta, where I put SMR on one side and beta on the other side, and it's randomized. So it's the combinations and permutations of randomized stimulation are just in the millions. And sure enough, 15 minutes in, I had this anorexic girl who became anorexic about 6 months after she had a severe flu, which basically shut down her brain and left her with OCD and an inability to reason, and became anorexic. And we had massive alpha waves coming out of her, although we never gave her alpha. We gave her SMR beta. And then kids with concussions from hockey and people with car accidents and people with military and my cohort in California, Becky Basham, you like to interview here. She's been using our stuff with NFL football players who've lost their entire they've lost their entire lives once they've got too many concussions playing football with the NFL. And we are rehabbing these guys back into complete normal functioning again. Most of these people don't show any signs on an MRI. So is it really a brain injury? It's hard to say. Or has it healed itself in the process? But it certainly is a metabolic shutdown. And just by kind of dumb luck, I guess, hacking at it long enough, I discovered that entrainment was probably the most effective tool you could ever use for this type of signature. Now, we use it for a lot of other things too, but for this signature, I'm really excited about this topic. And so I do have a 100-minute video explaining all about brain injuries, how they lead to Alzheimer's. That's the other part of it. And also how entrainment will fix this. And in fact, there is Tom Budzinski. I don't know if you know Tom Budzinski and Leslie Sherlin. Leslie Sherlin's the past president of the ISNR. Tom was doing a study with us in Seattle in 2 seniors' homes, and with cognitive decline in seniors. And just accidentally, this lady was severe early onset Alzheimer's. She was only 57 and had severe Alzheimer's, and she was expected to pass away in the coming months. And by accident, they got her into the study, and because she was sort of the special case, they did QEEGs, they did Loretta's, they did a lot of brain imaging, processing on her. She had no alpha waves, just like my population, which leads to severe insomnia, because they also don't make delta waves, which then stops the brain from cleaning up the protein deposits at night, which astrocytes do only in the presence of large delta waves. And these people can't make them. So they fill up with protein. And in 5 to 10 years, they have full-blown Alzheimer's or chronic traumatic encephalopathy if you tell the doctor you had a concussion. But to me, they look like exactly the same malady or the same condition. And anyway, this lady, after 30 sessions of entrainment, moved out of the seniors' home, moved back into her own home, could walk through downtown Seattle, never get lost, had a normal gait again, and went on to have a completely normal functioning life. And when you see pre and post Loretta's and QEEGs, the biggest factor that changed in her brain was she went from low voltage, kind of flatlined, no alpha, to a nice big alpha wave, a big alpha peak at 10 hertz. And this whole thalamocortical disconnect thing that's tied to lactate and ATP and norepinephrine and things like this, and getting them fired back up metabolically. And so anyway, that's pretty exciting. So we've got a few studies now on seniors with cognitive decline, and we've got some cases with Alzheimer's. I'm really trying to encourage people to do a study. We need grad students to do studies on this, because so far there's nothing that has been this effective. And I've been lecturing on this for several years now, and I still don't have any grad students picking up a study on it. But we got to keep getting that word out there.
Yeah, if any of the listeners want to do a study, there you go.
It'll be huge. It'll be huge. Whoever does this study will probably become famous, and we'll be lecturing for many years about it.
Dave, going back to what you were saying before about with like the frequencies not necessarily not necessarily needing the entrainment in the frequency that they're deficient in. That was actually one of the most striking things from your presentation at the Neurofield conference that I remember, was you showed, I believe, some QEEG maps of an individual, I think with ADHD, who had like way too much theta production. And I think you actually gave that individual a theta entrainment, and it actually reduced the theta production, which I was like, I found that so fascinating. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
That was an exciting moment for me. Basically, I was having conversations with Herschel Tumim, who had the HEG, the hemoencephalograph. It was called the thinking cap. And it's a cerebral blood flow neurofeedback device. So you put a little infrared transmitter on the forehead and a little receiver over here. And as your hemoglobin and your blood flow go up, it blocks the light, and then it plots it on a graph. It shows that you're doing better and better. And so he was using that as neurofeedback. And then we were talking about how entrainment was shown to drive up cerebral blood flow. So at an ISNR conference, we just happened to grab somebody who was walking down the hallway, and we said, let's hook you up to this HEG and we'll put the entrainment on and see what happens. Well, we drove up his cerebral blood flow 15% in 10 minutes. So Herschel was very excited about this. And so I said, on a frequency model, if someone had high theta and you gave them theta, neurofeedback people would go nuts over that. They'd say, oh my God, what are you doing? But on a cerebral blood flow model, all the studies show that a hypoperfusion of cerebral blood flow is tied to excess theta activity. So on a blood flow model, it might work really well. And since 7.8 hertz drives up cerebral blood flow the highest of all the frequencies from delta to gamma, I mean, they all do drive up blood flow, but 7.8 drives it up the highest. Just by dumb luck, 2 weeks later, I had this college student who was dropping out of college or considering it. And she was about 4 standard deviations high with about 7.5 hertz high theta, especially frontally. She could only read 2 paragraphs. And she was fogged right out. In fact, that's part of why she was so exhausted, is because she would be studying till 3 o'clock in the morning and then getting up at 7 a.m. to go to, or 8 a.m. to go to school. And she was forever exhausted. I'm sure that added to her slow signature because she was tired, but she did have this prevailing condition. And so that, well, let's give her Schumann then at 7.8 and see if it does anything for her. And sure enough, 30 minutes of Schumann. Then there's a refractory period, and you need to wait 15 or 20 minutes for the brain to kind of recover, because it switches to metabolizing of oxygen through lactate and ATP about 5 minutes into entrainment. And you, just like a runner would do if a runner is doing a long haul run, and you have to give the brain a 15, 20 minutes to switch back. And Tom Budzinski was the one who enlightened me to that aspect of it. So we waited 20 minutes, wrapped her. Now she was almost completely normal, even though I gave her the frequency she should not have on a neurofeedback model. And she also read 10 pages absolutely fine before she felt she was starting to get a little foggy. You got to admit, sometimes when someone's brain is shut down, and you hammer them with so much excitation from something like entrainment, it can be a little tiring in the process. But nonetheless, she went from 2 paragraphs to 10 pages and then stayed in school.
That's fascinating. Let's talk about what you had alluded to with this, levels of cerebral blood flow in terms of the different frequencies. So that 7.8 hertz, tell me about that. It's the Schumann resonance, is that correct?
Yeah, that's the Schumann resonance of the Earth, which has all kinds of spooky, mystical things attached to it. It's really not that big a deal. When lightning strikes, there's a massive electromagnetic signature that shoots through the sky from a lightning strike. And if you take the ionosphere, which radio waves bounce off the ionosphere, and ham radios and CB radios use what they call skips all the time when they can talk to someone 1,000 miles away just with a 10-watt transmitter, if they get the skips right, and the signal just bounces off the ionosphere all the way around the Earth. And if you take that circumference and you divide it into the speed of light, you get 7.8. It's not that big a deal, but there's nothing spooky or mystical about it. It's just basic physics. But these resonances, though, do circulate around the Earth. And anyway, just by weird coincidence, the brain happens to have maximal cerebral blood flow increases when you flash lights at 7.8. Now, Fox and Rakely, who did the study, never commented on Schumann, because I'm sure they didn't know anything about the Schumann. I'm sure they didn't know anything about it, or they would have commented on it. Does that mean that it was just by coincidence that the brain just happens to be at this alpha theta border, that it has maximal blood flow increases with entrainment? Or is there really a Schumann connection? I think there should be more research done to that, because we might find that when you look at all these apartment buildings and office buildings that have, thousands of tons of rebar and stuffed into all the walls and in the concrete, and they're all grounded out, and that would therefore ground out the Schumann resonances that are flying around in the sky. Could that be contributing to psychiatric disorders?
That would be super interesting to look at that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about in terms of with the stimulation. So the electrical stimulation that I know is part of some of the Mind Alive devices. Tell me about kind of what that is doing, and how that just kind of adds on to the whole cocktail of entrainment and stimulation.
Yes, we certainly do a fair bit of work with cranio-electro stimulation and transcranial DC stimulation, and sometimes transcranial AC stimulation as well. But I'll focus really on the CES, cranio-electro stimulation and transcranial DC stim. And I do have lectures posted on our website, and also written articles on those, as well as all the entrainment stuff. But CES, it too has a bit of a mystical, enigmatic kind of way, and it's probably over promoted. I hate to say that, but it's probably over promoted. I have found that CES is kind of hit and miss. You don't know if it's going to work or not work a lot of the time, but it's so easy to implement. You just wet the earlobes, you put the clips on the earlobes, and you just turn it on, and the person will either respond or not respond. If they respond, they really like it, especially for anxiety. It works very well for anxiety, depression to some degree, and insomnia and pain. But it's a kind of a 50-50 thing, you know, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but it's easy to implement. So in my office, I will implement it on people. But one of the things I have found, because I have a good professional brain mapper, I have a Mitzar brain mapper in our office, and I brain map everybody before, during, often, and after any kind of a treatment I give them. And I have found that people with people with fast running, eyes closed alpha, if their alpha is 12, 13, 14 hertz, eyes closed, it's probably tied to an imbalance between the stimulant neurotransmitters like norepinephrine versus GABA serotonin. And you have these imbalances going on in the brain. And Sheely had shown that cerebral spinal fluid levels of serotonin and endorphins jump 200% with CES in just 30-minute span. So it's pretty profound what it can do. So I'm finding the people with the fast running alphas are the best responders, and they pretty much 100% of them will respond to CES very well. They will, you put it on, and very quickly they're like, wow, this is what I've been looking for. And they're just, they just get this really mellow, trancey feel, and they're just like, they turn into marshmallows, and they just love it, absolutely love it. And so that it would make sense, because CES primarily hits the brainstem, where serotonin, acetylcholine, endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin are generated. And so it makes sense, but so properly used, CES is an extremely effective technology as well. But I think that its applications are more specific, in a sense, to that brain signature, although it does work on other signatures as well. And whenever I put it on myself, and I don't have that signature, but whenever I put it on myself, I just go, whoa, you know, and I start getting really dreamy pretty fast. It can put you into an alpha wave reasonably quickly, and that's been shown. But clinically, that's the most effective signature, is these fast, eyes closed alpha guys.
And you find, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you found, like, you know, I assume probably a synergy with the stimulation, because you combine in some devices the stimulation like at the same time as people are receiving the audio-visual entrainment.
Yes,
is there a synergy going on there?
There is. The Delight Pro is the one we combine them in, and so the synergy won't be there on some issues like ADHD, probably not, and some other things probably not. But on the maladies where it works, again, depression, anxiety, insomnia, and pain, sometimes the synergy is absolutely dramatic. It's huge. Either one, reasonable, but you combine the two and it is phenomenal. It's way more than the sum of its parts, if you want to put it that way. Kind of like 1 + 1 is 5, kind of a deal. Some people, again, the dissociative and the meditative aspects of breaking that HPA axis are paramount in so many people with anxiety. And they're so wound up that entrainment, some effects, CES, some effects, but they're not quite breaking that axis. The people can still hang on to all those anxieties and those worries and those fears and the racy head. You just can't quite get them out of it, because they're too overboard into that mindset. So that you have to combine the two of them and just wallop the daylights out of them, in a sense, if you want to call it that. Wallop the daylights out of that dysfunction, and then you'll just see them just melt. And the respiration will get smooth. Their hands will warm up. All the muscle tension, and we've done this with biofeedback gear. You see the muscles just let go in their arms and in their legs and in their face. They'll go from to just a relaxed looking, peaceful face in a 20-minute span. And that's when you really know you nailed it, you know, and that these guys are going to have a dramatic recovery just from breaking the HPA axis, not to mention any other neurological implications, just from getting them out of that headspace that's killing them. And yes, so it can really be dramatic. And some people don't need it, but those people who need it, that's the best combination we have found so far.
And then going back to what you were saying, I believe you were about to start talking about the direct current stimulation.
Yes, transcranial DC stim is a very fascinating technology. There are probably to date at least 1,800 studies on it, most of them double-blind, placebo-controlled, so it's good, solid science. And you can, if you have like a Brodmann area map and you know where the functions are underneath the scalp, you can put an electrode over that area and tune it right up. Typically done properly. And again, there's these hackers who are making some pretty bad stuff out there that doesn't work right. But so we have you have to tune your electrodes with your current so that what they call a current density, and that's the level of current per square centimeter is how it's measured. You could measure it per square inch if you wish, but it has to have a certain level or it won't activate the neurons properly. And you'll see some studies will say it didn't work, and some studies will say it was fantastic. Then if you take the current and you divide it by the area of the electrode, you can see why some studies failed and why some studies succeeded. So anyway, we've tuned ours to make sure that you don't have those issues. And it's remarkably well for stroke. That's probably some of the best gains it does for stroke rehab, whether it's aphasias, Wernicke's or Broca's aphasia, or it's motor issues with partial paralysis on one side of your body. It is probably the most effective technology you can use for stroke. And if you pair it with engaging in the therapy right away, so whether it's movement therapy, or whether it's speech or language therapy right after or during while you're actually stimulating that side of the brain, it's even more effective. I have seen it remarkably effective for depression. We often use entrainment for depression because it works reasonably well, but if a person is just stuck, and especially if on an EEG, you see the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex at F3, if you see that's got a lot of alpha in it, meaning, and that's your happy side, and if meaning that the happy side is kind of shut down because alpha is an idling rhythm. So if there's a lot of alpha on the left and not so much on the right, you need to get that alpha down on the left and get the happy side of the brain kicked back in again. And sometimes you have to down tune the right side, which is more your fear side, especially in acute cases like just someone who had recent trauma in war vets or car accidents or deaths or natural disasters and things like this. If it's acute, we'll put a cathode on the right and anode on the left. But often it's chronic and the right side is quite shut down too. So we only tune up the left side and use a right shoulder cathode. And it can be remarkable. You can take someone who's quite depressed and really, really struggling with internal thoughts, suicidal thoughts, and you can make them pretty darn cheerful in the course of 4 or 5 days.
Dave, what's your take on the utilization of all these different technologies for say, meditation or peak performance purposes? In terms of, we've talked about a lot of disorders, but tell me about how an individual who's looking to enhance either their meditation practice or perform better with whatever or both, what's the best way for that type of person to utilize these different pieces of equipment?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. It is really remarkable for peak performance. I do have an hour-long video lecture showing all kinds of Olympic athletes and other athletes using entrainment primarily to improve their game. There's also football players, hockey players, all of it. In peak performance, you really got to watch the lecture to get the whole gist of what's going on. There's a certain amount, especially in golfers, there's a certain amount of pre-game preparation you must do in your mind because golfers have too much time to think, compared to a hockey player or a football player or a soccer player. Golfers have way too much time to think, and they get caught up in the HPA axis when something goes a little wrong, and then they get paralysis by analysis and shuts them down, and then their game often gets worse unless they can recover from that. So if they can practice, breathing, meditation during the golf game, they can keep themselves reasonably in the zone, but so many of them don't have that ability. And in fact, most athletes don't have that ability on the mental side, and so they start to crash. But entrainment has been shown, especially pre-game, jitters, new hotels, there's cameras, there's videos, there's news people all over the place, and they get overexcited, and that pushes them into the, have you heard of the Yerkes-Dodson curve? It's that bell curve. If you're under aroused or over aroused, your performance is down. There's a perfect arousal state. So many athletes train in a perfect arousal state, and they're going to get gold. But once they get to the actual, the big event, either they get pushed into over arousal, which impairs their performance, or they get exhausted, because if they're too excited to sleep and now they wake up and they're exhausted, now they're under aroused, then they can't perform either. So a lot of gold winners don't take gold at all because of the mental part of the games, and how overwhelming that can be, in hotels and travel and all those things. And we've got several Olympic athletes who definitely athletes in general, hockey players, NFL players, and so on, who definitely use entrainment, especially the night before they go out and do a game. But they also use it in training. They use it in visualizations, so they can visualize doing better. Christine Boudre was an example of a speed skater who was in a competition. She tripped on the ice, and speed skaters have these really long, nasty blades on those skates. And she tripped on the ice, and a skater behind her ran into her and cut her leg open. I think she had 150 stitches or so, almost died. It was very close, cut her into her femoral artery and stuff, and almost died. And so when she was visualizing, she always visualized skaters passing her, because from a fear perspective, if everybody's in front of you, if you fall, no one's going to run into you. And she knew she could not win the Olympics if everybody's passing her. So her trainer got her onto our gear for the entrainment. And as soon as she started using entrainment, she went from a negative performance cycle to a positive performance cycle. And she saw herself passing skaters. And she took silver in the Olympics. So that was good. Your own Glenn Eller, who was, I think, 17th place in trap shooting, got on entrainment just a few months before, I forget which Olympics, I think it was Beijing, the Olympics. And one of our distributors got him onto our David Pal system when we were making those devices. Just a few months prior to, he took gold. So that was good. There's other accounts of other athletes, and also post-career applications of entrainment is very important too. A lot of very elite athletes, they've been isolated from family and from friends. They're lonely. Haven't been sleeping well. They've been pushing their adrenals, to the limit for years. And once the Olympics are done, or their career is done, they slide into depression, and some of them become very suicidal. Catherine Garceau was one such lady who was a synchronized swimmer, and she went into severe depression. She wrote a book called Swimming Out of Water, and it was all about her Olympic career and how when she slid into depression, along with several other of her teammates, they all put on 100 pounds of weight gain because they started craving carbs. They all went completely out of shape, were suicidal. And she used entrainment to get herself back into functioning. And again, nowadays she's lean, she's tough, she's fit. But she went through a real bad slide, and so did some of her other teammates. And she talks all about that. So entrainment has applications for all kinds of things, including simulators. There was a guy who was using entrainment with Indy 500 race car drivers on the simulators, because of course they would get over aroused on the simulator when they're doing all kinds of near hits with other cars. And if you get over aroused, then you get impulsive and you make judgment errors, and then you destroy $1 million car. So on the simulators, he was using view hole eye sets, as you could see through it, and he was keeping them in an alpha zone, so it'd just stay really calm and cool, like an astronaut might be, who has, astronauts have extensive training, and they can keep very, very calm when things aren't going well because of years and years, decades of training. But you can't afford to put decades of training into an Indy 500 race car driver. You need them to be good while they're in their 20s, or a football player, or a lot of athletes. You got to get them mentally good while they're still under 30 years of age, or you're going to lose the physical side of their abilities, right? So entrainment really, really fast tracks the mental aspects of performance. On another little note too, we actually got into the whole sports thing kind of a little bit by accident with the Dallas Cowboys back in 1988, when a psychologist, Bob Ward, who worked with them, got several devices from us. And they would put them in a fanny pack and have the had view hole eye sets so you could look out, and they had the football players in their workout, their workout routines. They were running as part of their training, to boost their cardiovascular, right? So they don't get so tired when they're on the field. And they would run faster and farther every single time they were on entrainment compared to being off entrainment. And what he attributed that to was, there's a little voice when we're working out that starts to say, we better be careful that we don't work out too hard because it might be a bad thing for us. And it actually makes us have an impaired workout. It actually takes us down, this little voice. And by running entrainment, it takes us away from, it kind of dissociates us away from that voice. And so we actually do what our bodies can do rather than what our brain tells us we can do. Because the brain often will go into a kind of a protective mode. It doesn't want us to hurt ourselves. And so it'll step in and intervene long before we've given ourselves a good push. So that's how it started, was with the Dallas Cowboys.
Well, Dave, we're coming up onto the end of the show. I absolutely love hearing all of these stories and just your broad spectrum of expertise with all of this. Tell me, if the listeners wanted to find out more about your work, more about Mind Alive, where would you direct them to?
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, well, power is knowledge, or knowledge is power. And so that's why we've been so intensive on the research side of it. So go to mindalive.com, and there's two ways you can go. I really think people should go to the training tab and then select webinars. And that's, in the year of COVID, I did a lot of recording, had more spare time. And you'll see physiology of entrainment, clinical applications that are cognitive, other types of applications. There's CES, tDCS, heart rate variability, stuff on brain. There's all kinds of webinars that I've posted. The concussion stuff is there. And watch the webinars. I think that's the best way to get the training. I have a fair bit of written stuff as well. And if you go to the research tab instead of the training tab, the top listing says research articles by Dave Siever. And you'll see about 20 articles that I've published over the years, but some of them are getting quite dated, and they won't be as up to date nearly as the recorded videos are. But some people want to see the printed stuff so they can see the references and all that, and maybe track the research. Also, if you're a grad student out there and you want to do more research with our gear, which I would love, we certainly love grad students, and we will support them any way we can with equipment, with references, with expertise, study designs, and all of that kind of stuff.
Right on. Well, for those listeners who enjoyed the show, go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're Roscoe's Wetsuit. Also, if you guys enjoyed the show, go ahead and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That would be greatly appreciated. You can find audio versions of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and just about anywhere else that you find audio podcasts. Dave, again, thank you so much for your time today. It was really a pleasure having you on the show.
And thank you, Toby, for taking the interest to have me on your show. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.